but it's all, it sort of works because it's all contained within four walls and everybody sees each other. This day-to-day crisis intervention and firefighting and stuff that keeps the wheels on the train. Understand that will not scale. That will be a disaster if that happens. Now, this is a particular challenge if you're in an Agile world, because I think the Agile folks are still trying to figure out how to adapt to outsourced projects really well. There are some people who are doing some work on it, but there appear to be differing schools of thought about the outsourceability of Agile projects, and I don't want to speculate on that or go too far into that here. I talked about Agile challenges in the last webinar, but certainly I think if you're on a project, you're following an Agile methodology, you'd want to talk to people about how are we going to adapt these various Agile processes that we have to our outsourced scenario. So remember, Agile, waterfall, V-model, whatever you're doing, you can't count on sort of chance emails, hallway discussions, individual heroics, firefighter activities by individual contributors and managers. That's not going to work, because the people will not be able to notice that things are going wrong, because they'll be going wrong in different time zones, potentially, certainly out of eyesight, and often out of effective email and instant messaging range because of the time zones. So understand, outsourcing is always going to increase project complexity, and anytime complexity goes up, risk goes up, and we'll look at this a little bit more later. So anytime you're dealing with a more complex project, you need to think about planning, organization, tracking, managing the execution of the project. These things become more and more important. Accidental miracles are much less likely in an outsourced scenario. Okay, now, different organizations approach things in a different way. And you might be looking at this going, well, what does that have to do with Cadillac? Well, here's what that has to do with a Cadillac. It's a Johnny Cash song here, One Piece at a Time, which some of you might have heard at one point or another. It's worth a listen if you can find it. It's about a guy who, it's a minimum wage guy working on a Cadillac assembly line, and he really wants a Cadillac, but he realizes the kind of money that he makes, he's just never going to get a Cadillac, and so, union scale is not going to cut it. But he decides that he's going to get a free Cadillac by basically taking home one piece at a time. He's just going to sneak something out every day in his lunchbox, and at the end of his career there in the Cadillac assembly line, he retires and decides that he is going to put together all of the pieces, and the pieces didn't really fit together, and so he ends up with his car that's got two headlights on one side and one on the other, and it was free. It didn't cost him a dime, but it's not exactly what he thought he was going to get at the end of that process, and that definitely is something that can happen with outsourcing if you don't deal with the mapping, integrating, and standardizing tasks that will face you. You have to have approaches that mesh. So related upstream, downstream processes, any place there's a handoff or touch point, you have to look at how is that going to work. As an example, when the software is to be delivered from the development organization to the test team for system testing, how is that going to work? And I mean in detail. You can't, yeah, these guys, they'll let us know when it's ready. That will not suffice. You're going to have to think about this stuff, because I have seen fairly serious crises break out when these sorts of handoffs were not properly defined, and then you went to try to execute it and it turned out to be a lot more complicated than people thought. and things that, had they been done up front off the critical path, suddenly get on the critical path and cause significant delays in the testing. So, think about this stuff. Now, you could standardize glossaries for terminology, look at your processes, look at your templates, tools, information, and so forth. All of this stuff, the more aligned and congruent and consistent you can get the approach in the different organizations, the better. But it's also possible to go overboard here. So, you want to think about what's the simplest thing we could do to deal with this difference in approach. Could we perhaps solve 80% of the challenges associated with the differences in approach rather simply, and then leave the other ones to deal with themselves when they come up? Or are we going to get to the point where we're going to expend more effort trying to deal with this challenge, trying to make this challenge go away, than we would if we just lived with it during the project? So do think about that. Remember, the reason to standardize these approaches is not to have standardized approaches, but to support an effective and efficient process and project. Okay, so life cycle implications. Whatever you're doing, waterfall, V-model, Agile, Scrum, XP, RUP, whatever you're going to do, you need to make sure that the life cycle, either inherently or through additional effort on your part, is adapted to allow for the distribution of work, the effective distribution of work, and the efficient distribution of work. If it's going to create more work to figure out how to distribute the work than the work that's being distributed is, then obviously you're not getting anything out of this. Now, you also want to make sure that there are checkpoints and course correction opportunities at regular, predictable, and reasonable intervals. And this, obviously you don't want to do this too frequently. Those of you who have children may have been familiar with the refrain from the back seat, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet?" That's not something you want to do, because then you're going to be pestering people and you're introducing additional inefficiencies and frustrations into the process. But at the same time, if you don't check frequently enough, little mistakes that could easily have been resolved, easily and cheaply been resolved had it been discovered quickly, will fester into enormous problems. And by the time you discover them, the impact will be and can be very significant, and we've seen that happen with clients. So you certainly want to try to think about, well, how frequently do we want to have conference calls or virtual team meetings or something like that that allows us to have these checkpoints and make sure that we're doing the right things. Now, that has to be balanced against this third point here, the reducing of the complexity in handoffs, touch points, communications, change management, all those things. You want to make sure that you don't create some kind of overly complex process for doing checkpoints and course correction, or for any of these other coordinative activities that are going to need to happen between the client and the outsourcing organization. If you make this stuff overly complicated, you put too much overhead on it, then it's going to get